The wedding dress was already torn at the hem when she crossed the cattle guard, and the lace dragged a thin trail of red Texas dust behind her like a wound. She walked because the truck had quit 2 miles back, and the road had quit before that. She walked because there was nowhere else to go. Her veil hung crooked, pinned by a single comb that had survived the slap. Her shoes were in her hand. Her left foot was bleeding through the silk stocking, and she did not look down at it. The barn rose out of the dark like a low brown island, and she headed for the lantern in its window, because a lantern was the closest thing to a person she had seen in an hour. She did not know whose barn it was. She did not know if there was a man inside who would shoot first and ask questions in the morning. What she did know was the sound coming from inside, low and broken, the sound of an animal trying not to die. She pushed the door with her shoulder. Why did she walk toward it instead of away? Stay with me on this one. Her name was Elena Rivera, and 3 hours earlier she had been standing in a chapel outside Marfa, Texas, holding white roses her mother had grown all summer. She was 26 years old. She had spent 4 years waiting for a man named Garrett Hollies to make good on a promise, and that morning, in front of 72 folding chairs and a borrowed pastor, he had not. The chapel doors had stayed shut. The phone in his best man's pocket had buzzed twice and then gone silent. After 40 minutes, the best man had walked up the aisle holding the phone like a dead bird, and he had read the message out loud. Garrett was not coming. Garrett was in Houston. Garrett wanted his deposit on the truck back if she could see her way to it. The folding chairs had emptied row by row, and Alina had stood there with her bouquet and her veil, and the shape of a life that no longer existed. Her father had not been there to walk her down the aisle. He had died the spring before. Her mother had pressed a set of truck keys into her palm and told her to drive somewhere, anywhere, and not come back until she could come back without braking. So Alina had driven. She had driven east into the part of the county where the fences ran longer than the towns. She had driven until the gas gauge dipped, and the old Ford had finally given up on a dirt road that did not appear on any map she owned. She had taken off her shoes because the heels had begun to cut. Then she had started walking, because sitting still in a wedding dress on a county road was its own kind of dying, and she had decided that morning she was done with that kind. The barn appeared a little after sundown. It belonged to a piece of land called the Bar K, though she did not know that yet. She did not know that the man who owned it had spent the last 6 months watching every animal he loved go sick in ways the vet from town could not name. She did not know about the calves with the milky eyes, the old mare who had stopped eating, or the 3 goats that would not rise. She did not know about the dog. She only knew the lantern in the barn window was the first warm thing she had seen since the chapel, and the sound coming from inside the barn was the sound of something that did not want to be alone in the dark. So she pushed the door open. The lantern hung from a nail on a center post, and its light pooled in a yellow circle on the straw. In the circle lay a black and white border collie, ribs showing, breath shallow, eyes half open and not seeing. A man knelt beside the dog with his hat off and his back to the door. He did not turn when she came in. He spoke without turning. He said, "You can sit if you want, but I would be obliged if you did not say anything for a minute." Alina sat. She sat right down in the straw in her wedding dress, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she did not say anything for a long time. The man's name was Jonas Beck. He was 41 years old, a widower of 3 years, and the Bar K had belonged to his family since 1887. He did not look at Alina for a full 10 minutes. He kept one broad hand on the collie's chest, feeling the breaths come and go, and the other wrapped around a tin cup of water he had been trying to get the dog to drink. The dog's name was Pal. Pal had been Jonas's wife's dog before she died, and Jonas had not been able to give the animal away, and now Pal was 9 years old and dying of something the vet had called a long word that meant we don't know. 3 other dogs were buried under the cottonwood behind the house. Jonas had dug all 3 holes himself in the last 6 months. He had told himself he would not dig a fourth. When he finally turned and looked at the woman in the wedding dress sitting in his straw, his face did not change. A bride in a torn dress was, in the order of strange things he had seen on this land, somewhere in the middle. He asked her if she needed a phone. She said no. He asked her if anybody was following her. She said no. He asked her if she wanted coffee. She said yes, please. He walked to the small wood stove at the back of the barn, where he had been keeping a kettle warm. He poured her a cup. He set it down beside her in the straw and went back to the dog without another word. Elena watched him work. She watched the way his hand moved on the collie's side, slow and even. She watched him dip a clean rag in the tin cup and squeeze a few drops of water onto the dog's tongue. She watched him do this 7 times. The dog swallowed once. Jonas closed his eyes for a second when the dog swallowed. Then he opened them and dipped the rag again. Somewhere in the dark beyond the lantern, one of the goats made a soft, thin sound. Jonas's shoulders tightened. He did not turn toward it. He kept dipping the rag. After a while, Elena spoke. She said her name. She said where she had come from. She did not say why she was wearing the dress. She did not need to. He nodded once when she finished, and he said his name back to her, and he said, "There is a cot in the tack room and a clean shirt on the nail above it, and you are welcome to both." She thanked him. She did not move. She drank the coffee and she watched him work, and after a while she set the cup down and she crawled across the straw on her hands and knees in her ruined wedding dress, and she put her hand on the collie's head. The collie's tail moved. It moved 1 inch, maybe 2. It was the first time the tail had moved in 3 days. Jonas saw it. His jaw tightened. He did not say anything. He just kept dipping the rag, and Elena kept her hand on the dog's head. After a long time, Jonas said, "There are 6 others." Elena said, "6 others what?" He said, "6 others sick." He said, "The calves in the front pen, the mare in the second stall, the 3 goats in the back, and Pal here." He said, "The vet has been out 4 times." He said he can't find it. He says it might be the water, but the water tested clean. He says it might be the feed, but I have changed the feed twice. He said, "I don't know what it is." Elena did not answer for a while. Then she said, "My father was a curandero." She said he could not save himself, but he saved a lot of animals before he went. She said, "I watched him do it for 20 years. She said, "I do not know if I learned it." She said, "But I would like to try." Jonas looked at her then, really looked, and he nodded once and he said, "I would be obliged." She started with the mare. The mare was named Junebug, and she was 22 years old and she had not eaten in 5 days. Elena rose from the straw and walked across the barn in her bare feet, and she lifted the latch on the second stall and went in. Jonas watched her from where he sat. He kept his hand on Pal. The mare lifted her head when Elena entered, and her ears came forward, and she made the small, low sound that horses make when they are deciding if a person is safe. Elena stood in the stall doorway for a long time and did not move. She let the mare smell her. After a long while, Elena reached up very slowly and laid her hand flat on the mare's jaw, and she began to speak to her in a low, even voice, and the words were a mix of Spanish and English and some words that were not either, words her father had used. She moved her hand down the mare's neck, along her shoulder, along her flank. She stopped over the mare's belly, and her hand stayed there for a long time. Then she said, without turning, "There is something in her stomach that is not food." Jonas sat up straighter. He said, "What do you mean?" Elena said, "My father would say it was something she ate that she should not have." She said, "Do you have any black walnut on this place?" Jonas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The cottonwood behind the house came down in the storm last March." He said, "I cleaned up most of it, but I dragged some smaller branches into the back pasture and burned them." He said, "There were black walnuts mixed in." He said, "The mare grazes that pasture." He said, "I never thought of it." Alina said, "Do you have charcoal?" "The cooking kind." Jonah said, "Yes." She said, "Do you have flax oil or slippery elm?" He said, "I have flax." She said, "Get me both, and a clean bucket and warm water and a long syringe." Jonas got up. He moved faster than he had moved in a year. While he was gone, Alina stayed with the mare and kept her hand on the mare's belly and kept talking to her. The mare lowered her head and rested it against Alina's shoulder. When Jonas came back with the bucket and the charcoal and the flax and a long syringe from his calving kit, Alina mixed everything, filled the syringe, and eased it into the corner of the mare's mouth, slow and steady, and the mare swallowed. She gave her 3 syringes full. She put her hand back on the mare's belly. She closed her eyes. After about 20 minutes, the mare made a low sound and she stepped sideways once, and then she lowered her head into the empty feed bin and sniffed it, and she lifted her head and she looked at Alina, and Jonas, watching from the stall door with his hat in both hands, made a sound himself that was almost a laugh. Alina went next to the calves. There were 2 of them, a heifer and a bull, both about 4 months old, both with the milky film over their eyes that the vet had not been able to explain. Alina knelt in the pen, and she ran her hands along their flanks, and she lifted their eyelids, and she looked into their mouths, and she felt under their jaws. Then she said, "This is something else." She said, "This is in the water." She said, "Not the well water, the trough water." She said, "When did you last scrub this trough?" Jonas thought about it. He said, "I rinse it every week." He said, "But scrub it with a brush, I do not remember." Alina said, "The algae." She said, "There is a kind that looks like nothing and is poison." She said, "My father called it bad green." She said, "Drain the trough, scrub it down to the metal, refill it from the well, and add a half cup of apple cider vinegar to every 50 gallons. She said, "I will need yarrow if you have any growing wild on the place, and I will need the inner bark of any willow you can find." Jonas said, "There are willows down by the creek." She said, "In the morning." She said, "For tonight, just the trough." Jonas got the trough done in an hour. He worked by the light of a headlamp and the moon, and Alina went to the goats while he worked. The goats were in worse shape than she had thought. One of them, the smallest, was already very far gone. She knelt in the straw beside it and she put her ear against its side and she listened, and after a while she said, very quietly, "This one will not see morning." She said it without crying and without flinching. She said, "I am sorry." Jonas had come up behind her. He stood in the door of the goat pen with the empty bucket in his hand. He did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "Do what you can for the other 2." She said she would. She worked through the deep middle of the night. She did not sit down. Around 2 in the morning, Jonas brought her a clean flannel shirt, and she put it on over the dress and kept working. The 2 larger goats took the charcoal mix she had given the mare, and a tea she had brewed from wild yarrow Jonas had cut for her by flashlight. The smallest goat died at 12 minutes after 3. Alina was holding its head when it went. She closed its eyes with her thumb and stood up and said to Jonas, "The others will live if we get through tonight." Jonas carried the small goat outside. Alina went back to the dog. Pal was the hardest. Alina sat down in the straw beside the collie and put her hand on his chest, and felt the slow, uneven breath, and closed her eyes. After a long time she said, "Jonas, this one is not poison. This one is grief." She said, "When did your wife die?" Jonas, in the doorway with the lantern, did not answer for a moment. Then he said, 3 years ago last March." Alina said, This dog has been waiting to follow her, she said, and tonight he had decided it was time. She said, but I do not think it has to be tonight. Jonas knelt down on the other side of the dog. He put his hand on the dog's head. Alina put her hand over Jonas's hand. She began to speak in the low, even voice again, almost all Spanish, and Jonas did not understand the words, but he did not need to. The dog's breathing slowed. Then it deepened. Then it became regular. Pal opened his eyes. He looked at Jonas. He looked at Alina. He licked Alina's wrist once, very gently, and then he closed his eyes and went to sleep, the kind of sleep that is sleep and not the other thing. Jonas did not move his hand from under hers for almost a minute. After that, the night went quiet. The lantern burned low. The barn settled into the kind of stillness that only happens an hour or two before dawn. Jonas brought a second cot in from the tack room and set it up near Pal. He brought her a wool blanket. She lay down on the cot in his flannel shirt and what was left of her wedding dress and watched the lantern flame for a while, and then she did not watch anything because she was asleep. Jonas did not sleep. He sat on the hay bale and looked at the dog and at the woman, and once, just once, he reached up and wiped his face with the back of his hand. The wood stove ticked as it cooled. The barn cat came down off the beam and curled up against Pal's back. It was an ordinary spring night on a ranch in West Texas. Jonas sat and listened to the ordinary sound of it, and he found that his hands were not shaking anymore for the first time in a long time. Then the rooster crowed, and everything began at once. It crowed an hour earlier than it should have, and it crowed twice, and the second crow turned into a strangled sound that died halfway through. Jonas was on his feet before the sound had finished. He grabbed the lantern off the post. Alina sat up on the cot with her hair in her face and her eyes already wide awake, the way ranch women's eyes wake up. She said, "What is it?" Jonas said, "The chickens." He was already moving toward the barn door. They got to the chicken coop together. The lantern light hit the wire and Jonas swore, just once, very quietly. 3 hens lay on their sides in the dust, their feet drawn up under them, their eyes glazed. The rooster lay across the threshold of the coop, with its wings spread. 2 more hens were on their feet but staggering, their heads low, their combs gone the color of ash. A small black shape was disappearing under the coop. Alina said, "What was that?" Jonas said, "Possum maybe, but possums do not do this." He knelt down by the rooster. The rooster's beak was open. There was a thin line of foam at the corner. Jonas said, "This is poison." He said, "This is fast poison." He said, "Somebody put something in this coop." Alina was already moving. She said, "The trough." She said, "The feed bin in the barn." She said, "Anywhere there is water or grain, we have to check it now." Jonas was already running. They moved through the next 40 minutes the way 2 people move when they have been doing the same work all night, without talking, handing each other tools, taking the lantern from the other and setting it down where it needed to be. The trough Jonas had scrubbed at midnight was clean. The barn feed bins were clean. But in the tack room, in a corner Jonas had not opened in a year, behind a stack of old saddle blankets, there was a small open burlap sack of grain that was not Jonas's grain. The grain was a color Jonas's grain had never been. It had a faint sweet smell that Alina recognized before Jonas did. She said, "That is not for animals." She said, "That is for what you put in the barn when you want the rats to die." She said, "Somebody put this here." Jonas stood up holding the sack at arm's length. His face had gone the color of the rooster's comb. He said, "I know who." He said it the way a man says a name he has been carrying in his teeth for months. Alina did not ask. She did not have to ask, because at that moment headlights swung up the long dirt drive of the barquet, and a truck she did not know but Jonas clearly did pulled into the yard, and a man got out of the driver's seat. The man was tall and thin, and he wore a clean black hat and a clean white shirt, and he walked toward the barn the way a man walks who believes he owns the ground he is walking on. Jonas stepped out of the barn into the gray pre-dawn light, and Alina stepped out behind him. The man in the black hat stopped when he saw Alina. He stopped the way a man stops when he sees a ghost. He said, "Alina." Alina did not move for a second. Then she said, very quietly, "Garrett, if you are still with me on this story, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next is the part I was not sure I should tell." Garrett Holly stood in Jonas Beck's yard at 6 o'clock in the morning in the clothes he had not worn to his own wedding, and he looked at the woman he had left at the altar, and his hand went to the pocket of his jacket. Jonas saw the hand move. Jonas had been seeing hands move on men's jackets since he was 19 years old. He stepped sideways in front of Alina without thinking about it, and he said, "Take your hand out of that pocket nice and slow, son." Garrett did not take his hand out of the pocket. Garrett looked past Jonas at Alina and he said, "What are you doing here?" Alina said, "I could ask you the same." Garrett said, "This place was supposed to be for sale by Friday." He said, "I had a buyer." He said, "The old man here was not going to last another month." He said, "You are not supposed to be anywhere near this county." Jonas said, "Get your hand out of that pocket, Garrett." Garrett took his hand out of the pocket. He was not holding a gun. He was holding a small glass bottle with a black lid, and the bottle was half full of a powder the color of bone. Jonas looked at the bottle. He looked back at Garrett. He said, in a voice that was almost a whisper, "You have been killing my animals." Garrett said, "I have been encouraging you to sell." Alina made a sound that was not a word. It was a sound her mother used to make when she was very angry and very quiet at the same time. She walked past Jonas, past the barrel of his upraised arm, and she walked right up to Garrett Holly's, and she looked up into his face, and she said, "Every animal in that barn is alive this morning." She said, "Every one." She said, "The rooster died and 3 hens died and 1 little goat died, and that is on you, and you will carry that." She said, "But the rest are alive." She said, "The mare is eating." She said, "The calves can see." She said, "The goats are standing." She said, "The dog." She said, "The dog is sleeping like a dog should sleep." She said, "I do not know what your buyer wanted with this land, but he is not getting it." She said, "Get back in your truck." Garrett did not get back in his truck right away. He looked at Alina for a long moment. Then he looked at Jonas. Then he looked at the bottle in his own hand, as if he had only just realized he was holding it. He set the bottle down on the hood of his truck. He got into the driver's seat. He sat there for a long time with his hands on the wheel. Then he started the engine. He backed out of the yard, slow and careful, and he turned the truck around at the gate, and he drove down the long dirt drive of the Bar K and out onto the county road, and he was gone. Jonas stood in the yard with his hat in his hand. Alina stood beside him. The sun was just starting to come up over the eastern fence line, and the light was the color of weak tea, and somewhere in the barn behind them Pal the border collie barked once, a clean, clear bark, the bark of a dog who has remembered that he is a dog. Alina began to laugh. Jonas began to laugh. They stood in the yard and they laughed until they were not laughing anymore but something else, and then they went back into the barn together to feed the animals. The sheriff came at noon. Jonas had called him from the kitchen phone after Alina had agreed to sit down at the table and eat a plate of eggs. The sheriff was a big slow man named Ramirez who had known Jonas's father, and he listened to the whole story without interrupting, and he wrote down the parts he needed in a small notebook. He took the bottle off the hood of Garrett's truck, which was still sitting in Jonas's yard. He took the burlap sack of poisoned grain out of the tack room. He took the dead rooster and the 3 hens and the small goat in a clean grain sack, because the lab in El Paso would want to see them. He asked Alina to tell him the story from the beginning, and she told him. And at the end he closed the notebook and said, "Ma'am, I will need you to stay in the county for a few days." Alina said, "I had not planned on going anywhere." Ramirez nodded. He shook Jonas's hand. He looked at Pal, lying in a patch of sun by the kitchen door, and said, "That dog looks better than the last time I saw him." Jonas said he is. The buyer Garrett had been working for turned out to be a development company out of Dallas that wanted to put a solar farm on the Bar K and 12 other ranches in the county. 3 other ranchers had also been losing animals in ways their vets could not explain. Within a week, the sheriff had matched the powder in the bottle to traces in the feed bins of 2 other ranches. Garrett Hollies was arrested at a gas station outside Van Horn on a Tuesday morning. He pled out for 14 years. The development company quietly withdrew its offers. Alina did not leave. She stayed in the tack room for 3 weeks, and then Jonas built her a small room off the back of the kitchen with his own hands. Her mother drove out from Marfa on a Sunday and looked at the ranch and looked at Jonas, and at the end of the visit, she hugged Jonas and said something in Spanish that made him take his hat off and hold it against his chest. Alina went into the next county and got her certification as a veterinary technician, and then her associate's degree in animal science. And by the 2nd year, she was the person ranchers called when their vet from town could not figure out what was wrong. She kept her father's notebooks in a wooden box on the kitchen shelf and read from them most nights. Pal lived another 4 years. He died in his sleep on a January morning, on the rug by the wood stove, with Alina's hand on his head. Jonas dug the hole himself, under the cottonwood, next to the other 3. Alina helped him fill it in. They stood by the small mound for a long time after, and Jonas said he was a good dog, and Alina said he was. The mare Junibug lived to be 29. The 2 calves grew up and had calves of their own. The goats got fat and mean and lived for years. The coop was rebuilt with finer wire that no possum and no man could get under or over. Jonas married Alina on a Saturday in October, 18 months after the night she walked into his barn. The wedding was in the yard. There were 41 folding chairs. Her mother walked her down the dirt aisle in a new white dress Alina had sewn herself, simple and plain, no veil, no train. The pastor was the same one who had stood at the chapel in Marfa. He did not mention it. Pal sat at Jonas's feet during the vows, old and gray around the muzzle but upright. Everyone ate brisket under a tent Jonas had borrowed from a neighbor. Somebody played a fiddle, and Alina danced barefoot in the dust with her mother, and then with Jonas, and the sun went down behind the western fence line the way it had for 140 years. Late that night, after everybody had gone home, Alina and Jonas walked out to the barn together. The lantern was still hanging on the center post where it had been the night she first came in. Jonas lit it. Alina stood in the yellow circle and looked around at the stalls, at the mare drowsing, at the calves in the front pen, at the goats curled together in the back, at Pal on his old burlap bed by the stove. She said, "I was going to keep walking that night." Jonas said, "Where to?" Alina said, "I do not know. I just did not want to stop." Jonas said, "I am glad you stopped." Alina said, "Me too." They stood there a while in the lantern light, and then Jonas blew the lantern out, and they walked back to the house in the dark, and the barn behind them held its sleeping animals safe through the night, and through every night after, for as long as either of them lived.